in Nazi Germany in 1937 is not a very favorable place and time to be born. But her parents took her across in 1940, left Germany, went across Russia, Korea, and Japan. And I'll comment, shortly before Hitler invaded Russia, they got across Russia in time and to Japan and on a ship for Seattle. And people met them there and they moved to Chehalis. So right there is a little piece of world history that's pretty extraordinary. The fortune to get out when they did, and the fortune to get on a ship from Japan to Seattle before Pearl Harbor and all those things. And then, of course, the greatest blessing is they ended up in Chehalis. Barbara will tell about growing up here, as she tells in her book. But then she went to Whitman after graduating, and then went to New York and became America's first major advertising executive who was female. We saw the show in the last decade, Mad Men, Madison Avenue advertising men. She's the first mad woman. And that doesn't pertain to her insanity, because she's her mental state, she's perfectly competent. So it's our honor to have her here today. She was with two classes in the high school today and took a lot of questions from them. They'd all read the book as part of their class. I just want to read you 4 little vignettes from her book before I turn over to Barbara. But before we get to that, a couple of things. The book is courtesy of the Chehalis Foundation. Her book is here, and she'll do a book signing afterwards, and we'd request a $20 donation as part of that. And Jenny told me, don't forget. You have cards on your table, and as you have questions, write them down, and Jenny will pick them up and bring them to me. Most of this time will be question and answer. So here are 4 vignettes from the book. My father, her father came here and began working for Sears and Roebuck in the farm store behind Market Street. My father is paid every 2 weeks, and by the end of the pay period, we no longer are able to have meat for our family dinners. That's Chehalis in the early 1940s. April 18th, 1946, we go to the courthouse to become citizens. We've never gone before to dinner in a restaurant all the years we lived in Chehalis. My father says on this momentous special day when we became American citizens, he will take us out to dinner to celebrate. We go to the coffee shop at St. Helens Hotel on Market Street. And here's a connection. We are sitting on the property that W.F. West and his wife donated to the school district, thanks in part to Don Rhodes' father's work. And where they made their living was from the St. Helens Hotel. Next, my parents take me with them to the office of Grant Armstrong, a prominent lawyer in Chehalis whom my parents admire. For my part, I sit at the desk of Grant Armstrong, the literal physical desk from where the West will and the Kaufman will were written. Chet Rhodes is the school superintendent when Barbara was growing up, and Don Rhodes, who's here tonight, becomes my first real boyfriend. Barbara's in the 8th grade, Don's in the 9th grade. One evening, Don walks me home. We're standing at the foot of the steps leading up to my house. Are you sure they really want to hear this? This is the G-rated version. We're whispering our good nights when all of a sudden, on this quiet night, I hear a loud banging on the front picture window. I look up, and there's my father in his long, flapping European nightshirt. He has a fiercely angry look on his face, and he signals for me to come in the house. All right. So we'll turn over to Barbara now, but I just want you to join me in welcoming her to Chehalis.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. you didn't tell the end of that story. I went into the house, rushed past my father, went into my bedroom, which I shared with my sister, who was 5 years younger, and my sister said, "Barbara, don't say your goodnights in front of the house. Go up to the corner where they can't see you." Which is what we did. I am so happy to be here with you tonight and to be back in Chehalis. It really is just a joyous occasion for me to have come full circle and to be back here in what we called CHS. It's just wonderful. So thank you all so much for coming. It's just a joy for me. I want to tell you a little bit about what the impetus was for my writing my book, and a little bit about who it's for, and what the stories are, for those of you who haven't read it, and a little bit about what I hope to accomplish with it. Just a few years ago, my younger sister called me, and she lived in Annapolis, and I lived in New York, and we spoke regularly about our families and so forth. Excuse me. And this time the call was different. She said, "Oh, is there any water, Grant? Grant Armstrong." Thank you, Jay. She said she had found among my father's papers a journal that my father had kept before and during our escape from Nazi Germany. And neither of us had known that this even existed. I had no recollection at all of our escape. I knew that we escaped, but I didn't know any of the details. And my sister sent me this journal, and it was just the most sort of emotionally shattering, practically, experience to read it and to know what my parents had gone through in order to escape the persecution of the Nazis. It was very late when my father decided that we really had to leave Germany. He thought, he was going to be fine, and he had been in the military in Germany for World War I. He had given to Germany. He thought Germany would give to him, but no. We had to get out, and he finally realized it was very difficult to get the appropriate documentation, but he finally did. Very difficult to get the money for passage, but he finally did, with the help of Quakers and Jewish associations. And so we could no longer go across the Atlantic Ocean, which was sort of the faster way to go because there were submarines there at that time, and we had to take the train from Berlin through to Lithuania, through Russia, including Siberia, Korea, China, and finally Japan. This was a 17-day journey, and as my father described it, it was totally terrifying. Totally terrifying. There were 82 refugees. The oldest was 81 years old, and I was the youngest at 2. And the train was stopped. It was a 17-day journey, and the train was stopped, I think, 14 times along the way, and every time they were panicked, that they would be taken off the train, would be taken to the camps. So it was, and I knew nothing about this, nothing. My parents never spoke about it. I had no memory of it whatsoever. And I was so focused on becoming an American that I asked no questions at all. So it was quite an emotional experience to me. I was overwhelmed. And I learned so much about my parents. I learned things that I never even thought about when I was growing up, how courageous they'd been, how brave they'd been, how determined they were. And they had such great perseverance to make a new life. They had gone through terrifying, harrowing, awful times, but they were completely optimistic and thrilled and elated about being in America, the land of the free. They always said, freedom. My father would say, I can be who I want, I can say what I want, I can think what I want, I can listen to the news and what have you. And there's opportunity here. With hard work, we can make a family life for ourselves. So I just was amazed by what I had learned from them. I really thought, as I read this thing, I mean, I'm, in my early 70s at this point, at the point that I read it, I should say, and I thought, I never want my own children to be as ignorant of what came before them as I had been about what came before me. So I'm going to try to write this story so it'll be there for my kids and their kids and future generations, so that they'll always know, because I think what comes before you is what makes you who you are, and I think that's really an important thing to know. So the story itself, as I say, I wrote it basically for my children and for future generations, and it really is sort of 3 different stories intertwined, and those of you who've read it know this, but let me just tell everyone else. First of all, it's about a story of a little refugee girl in a very strange little family in this town called Chehalis, where there was no one else like us. When my family came, my father had $10.50 for our whole family, the clothes that we were wearing, and whatever he could carry, he and my mother could carry, including me, at 2.5. And they had been in a sports club in Berlin, and they had a tent from that time. And so they brought their tent with them, thinking we could live in this tent if all else failed, and we had nothing else. He had no idea how would he make a life when he got to America. What would happen? He wrote in his journal 3/4 of the way around the world into the unknown. And just the bravery and the courage to do this. Of course, the alternative was so horrendous that there was no option, but it sort of just amazed me to learn about it and understand it. So the first piece of the story is my really fervent desire to become an authentic American. I wanted to be like all the other kids, and I didn't want to look like Heidi, for those of you who remember Heidi when you were kids and reading it, like a little European girl with long cotton stockings and weird clothes and what have you. I wanted to wear all the kinds of sweaters that everybody else wore and the kinds of shoes that everybody else wore, and I just wanted to be one of the kids. So that's part of it. Second is the story of a wife and a mother. I have 3 adult sons now, and just like everybody else, our family went through turbulent times, including my husband's having 2 very serious strokes when he was quite young. So, I spent 25 years as a caregiver for my husband, and we have a very closely bonded family, and the story really tells about that. And then the third piece is my life as kind of a trailblazing executive in a very male-dominated business, advertising, and I found some success in that world, and it was very interesting and challenging, because it was a time when women didn't really have very many opportunities to build careers. So those were the stories, and a couple of the principles that have guided my life, and I hope that of my kids, is that my mother always said to me, dream big, work hard, never quit. And my parents both felt fervently about the importance and the power of education to open the doors to opportunity, to really make those dreams become a reality. So I've always said to my kids and anybody else who has been interested in reading my story that those are important principles to think about, because I think they really make sense no matter what part of life you're in. I really believe that. And so just before we take your questions, well, it's just been, it's been quite an experience all around. And for those of you who have read the book or will read the book, I hope that I can inspire even one person, and I'll feel like I made a difference that mattered. So let's have some questions.
So I gave you the homework assignment that if you have questions, please write them down. If we need to, we'll just take them from the audience. But I'll start with a question for Barbara, that as I was reading your book, here's this kid in Chehalis in these unusual circumstances that you arrived, but here you are in 1940s, graduate from here in 55. Do you feel as though from this community, but also in this society, there are more, the same, or fewer opportunities for young people than there were to go on to careers when you were growing up?
Oh, I think there are many, many, many more opportunities. The world has changed in so many ways, technology being one important thing, but many, many more opportunities, and particularly more opportunities for women, which still, is a harder road to hoe in some respects, but the opportunities are there, and I feel really strongly that with education, hard work, perseverance, you can really capitalize on those opportunities and make a difference in your life. I really feel strongly about that.
So Chehalis 2023, Chehalis 1955. What do you see that's different?
This library, this school is very different. I can't quite figure out the geography. I keep trying to find my way, and I can't quite figure it out. But it's very exciting to see how Chehalis has blossomed. The whole athletic fields and I forgot what you call where the swimming pool is, and the playground, and the what is it called, the penny playground and so forth. All of those things are fantastic. But generally speaking, the city, the town has just expanded geographically. When we started high school out here, this was kind of the country. We were really at the very edge of town, and there wasn't much going on. There was a little bit of a development, but very, very little. And, I think Callison's was sort of the big industry, and there was nothing, no mall, no nothing. So, it's very exciting to see what's gone on here. And I was telling Jay and Jenny, what a wonderful, wonderful thing it's been to know about the Student Achievement Initiative, which I think is just unique in communities. And the thing that's so important about it, to my way of thinking, is that it's not just something that happens with the kids who are in school and the faculty, but it's really something that has changed the culture of the community in such a profound way. It's just been a pleasure to know about it and to be able to contribute what little I can to help keep it going and help it burgeon. It's a huge, huge thing for a community like Chehalis to have a program like this that has such intellectual energy behind it and such support from so many constituents within the town. It's fabulous. It's fabulous. It's a great, great model that could be taken many places around the country.
So I'll tell you that through the Chehalis Foundation, Barbara contributes to a scholarship fund through the class of 1955, and a lot of people are part of that class that are still contributing. But the question to you is, there you live in Upper East Side, New York. Your kids aren't going to be going to school here, neither will your grandkids. Why do you contribute to that scholarship
Well, just
here?
for the same reason that I just said, because I believe so strongly that what's happening here with the Student Achievement Initiative is so important. I want to do whatever small thing I can do to keep it going and to help it grow. And I must say to you, my kids, one of my sons is the head of an independent school in New York, nursery through 12th grade, and he's very much an education person. And I have two daughters-in-law who are deans and teachers in independent schools. And they're all fascinated by what's going on in Chehalis because I talk about it a lot. And I think even down the road, they're going to continue to be interested and hopefully we'll do what they can to keep it going.
Has anyone written a question? If not, okay. All right, Jenny will pick those up. So yeah, lift those up so Jenny can pick them up. So you spoke to two classes today. What was the most interesting question you got?
What was the most interesting question? Oh, Oh, I don't know.
Top few.
Well, people were very interested in sort of the same thing you asked me. What's the difference now between when I was in Chehalis and today? That was an interesting question. People were interested in what it was like to raise a family and have a career at the same time, and did I ever feel any stress? And the answer was yes, like every day. Let's see.
Why would that be stressful to be raising children and to have a husband who'd been disabled and to have a world-class advertising career? Why would that be stressful?
A lot going on. I've traveled a lot, so a lot of people were interested in my travels. What was the worst place I'd ever been? What was the most interesting place I'd ever been? So we had some discussion about that.
All right, here's a question. What classmate of yours had the strongest impact on you, and how did they impact you so much?
Well, my best friend in high school is someone some of you might know, Dixie Gillingham Sturza. And she, you know, it was so important to me to be sort of an American girl and to have friends, you know, and to be in a group of kids. And Dixie was my go-to person. And Dixie, she was just a dear, and continues to be today, and is very sorry she can't be here tonight, actually. She and her husband, Butch Sturza, are on a cruise through the Panama Canal, but they're streaming in, I think. Hello, Dixie. So she was one of the first people I knew in my group in school who had a car. And she and her family and her uncle and aunt owned the Yardbirds, which I'm sure you all know. And she lived sort of in an apartment above the store. And so she drove her old Ford car every morning and picked me up for school. And we came to school together, and we were just dear, dear friends. She was fascinated with my family. She thought my mother was the most wonderful cook, and she loved staying with me because we had these sort of German-like comforters, which my mother called feather beds. And Dixie loved snuggling into this feather bed, and we'd sit and gossip and talk into the wee hours of the night. And then we had a big tradition in our house for making Christmas cookies. You know, my mother would bake for days and days and days, and everything would smell great. She was a great baker. And Dixie just couldn't get over these Christmas cookies. She still makes some of them today from my mother's recipe. So Dixie was my very dear friend. So from that perspective, she was somebody who had a big impact on my life.
So I have a report that one of your children, maybe two of your sons, are zooming in and have sent questions. So
You're kidding.
Here's the first one.
Oh,
Who is your favorite child? And the second one. We'll pass over that one.
Who is your favorite child?
Yeah, we'll pass over that one. All right, second one, though, is from your son, Michael. Who was your favorite teacher, and what did you take from them that you used later in life?
I had two teachers that I particularly remember and loved. One was Impy Sari. Does anybody remember her? Oh, I adored her. She was very smart, very precise, and whenever we took tests, the person who got the highest grade sat in the front seat, and you had to rotate every time you took a test. She seated us all in the order of our scores. I loved her dearly. And I think she was very interested in my family because she was Finnish. I think her family was from Finland, and she was kind of interested that we were an immigrant family, and she sort of took a liking to us. And my mother adored her, and she liked my mother a lot. And I loved Thelma Brooks. Do any of you remember her? Oh, I adored Thelma Brooks. And Thelma Brooks, she's sort of a very narrow lady with very tight, gray, springy curls. and was very authoritative in the class. And she was our English teacher. And you know, I've thought she was a wonderful teacher, and I felt like I was learning so much. And one day she said to me, well, she would like to stay after class and come and see her. And I thought, oh my goodness, what did I do? I'm gonna have some big problem. So I stayed. She said, please come up to my desk. And I said, okay. She said, you mustn't wear so much rouge. I said, I'm nervous, and I said, well, I don't wear rouge. I don't wear any makeup. I just wear a little bit of lipstick. No, she said, you mustn't wear, and she pinched my cheek, and she looked at her fingers, and she said, no rouge. And that was our bonding moment. And then when I decided that I wanted to go to Whitman, we had to take the SATs to go to Whitman, and we couldn't take the SATs in Chehalis. You had to go to the University of Washington. And I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to do that? You know, my father worked and I didn't drive, and Miss Brooks said, I will drive you to the UW to take your tests. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is really something. So Miss Brooks picked me up in her car, and she took me to the UW, and I was so terrified. I had always read about people whose teeth chattered and whose knees knocked and so on, but I didn't realize it really happened until I got there, and that was all happening. And she waited for me, and then we went home, and Don Rhodes drove me today down here, and we passed the Poodle Dog restaurant, and that's where Miss Brooks took me to dinner after the SATs. So she really was fabulous. She made she was somebody who made a difference in my life, and I always appreciated her for that.
I'll tell an impy sorry story from the wrong side of the tracks in my family. I had two older sisters who were outstanding students, and they had Miss Sorry for writing, grammar, English, and then she retired, and I started high school not as good a student, not as diligent at that point anyway, as a student, and for the next 4 years, whenever I would write an incomplete sentence or have my punctuation wrong, my family would say, too bad you didn't have Mrs. Sorry.
She was very, very meticulous.
Yeah. So here's one I understand is from Rob Sturza. What was your favorite product you promoted in advertising?
Oh, well, you asked me what were some of the questions that came up in the classes this afternoon. That was another one. Who was my favorite client? What was my favorite product? One of the things that I loved about being in the advertising business was that I had an opportunity to work with so many different types of businesses on so many different products and services and issues and so forth. So I always found it hard to find a favorite. The clients that I most liked to work with were the ones who really understood the power of advertising and appreciated the fact that advertising could make a difference in building their brands, building their traffic to whatever their service might be, building their business. And I loved working with companies like that, including Procter & Gamble, General Foods, Revlon in its day, which was, you know, the big cosmetics company in America. They really understood how powerful advertising was. And they pushed us to do our very, very best work. They were very difficult to work with. You know, they had an office in the General Motors building on Fifth Avenue in New York, which, you know, in those days was sort of a brand new, very elegant building, and they were in a very high floor. And they would call us over on a hot summer afternoon for a meeting, and we always had to wait in this little room, tiny little room that had no windows and no ventilation, and we'd all be sweating and waiting for this meeting to start. It would never start on time, so finally we'd open the door and peek out, and the whole place was dark. Everybody had gone home, and Mr. Revson, who ran everything, owned the company, ran everything, he was actually on his yacht sailing someplace in the Caribbean, you know. So they made us sweat, so to speak. And in spite of it all, we really loved working for them because they really understood how valuable advertising was in really creating an aura, a character for their brands. So that was great. I don't know whether it was my favorite client, but one of the campaigns that I feel most proud of, because it had the most importance societally, was the work that we did for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They came to us, the issue was teenage drunk driving, which caused so many fatalities. It was a huge problem, and the fatality rate was increasing rapidly. And we'd been their agency, and they wanted us to run advertising about sort of the fear of death that was associated with teenage driving. And, you know, we did advertising about that, and the advertising was fine, but it absolutely made no difference. Fatalities kept rising. So my role in this whole thing was that we were sort of pioneers in the area of doing consumer attitude research, which was a new thing. I mean, today everybody does it, but it was a very new thing in those days, doing quantitative attitudinal research to find out not just who's drinking how much of what, but what are the attitudes that surround their feelings about drinking? What are their wants and needs, their emotional state, et cetera? And that led us to a campaign that really was dramatically the opposite of what had been done before. Before it was about fear and terror, we moved to a campaign about friendship and empathy. And that led to something that you probably all remember, the famous line, "Friends don't let friends drive drunk," which still exists today, you know, 30 years later, 25 years later. But the campaign was not just about that line. It was about a whole program that taught people what to do when they were out with friends drinking. Take their keys, ask them to stay over, call a cab, name a designated driver. These were all new ideas at that time. And that changed things totally dramatically. That as soon as we started running this campaign, drunk driving deaths among teens dropped dramatically. So I felt very proud of that. You know, this was not necessarily a client that even appreciated fully the power of advertising until we did this program for them. So that was really an important thing, to be able to save lives.
Barbara, I have a message from Dan Feigin. He says, "Have fun, Mom."
I want to take you back.
Here's another one.
Okay, I want to take you back to Revlon. Did you start wearing rouge when you?
Never. I have very red cheeks to start with.
All right. Okay, so this sounds like it's from your son.
Oh, dear.
Also, different Dan. Were there moments in your advertising career when growing up in a small town felt especially important or brought extra insight?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Oh, sorry. You know what? That's not from your son. The one below says, "Have fun, Mom," from your son. This one's from my daughter, Bryn Hunter, in Seattle.
Oh, okay.
All right.
I always think that my background here influenced my thinking. You know, it's sort of part of who I am, and I really can't say it any better than that. You know, my son Michael, who may be one of the correspondents here, I'm not sure, he always laughed because he said, you know, I just think it's really amusing to think that this little refugee girl from Germany who spoke no English is now sort of leading the way in terms of determining how to determine attitudes among American consumers. Like, how did that happen? Where did that come from? So, yes, I think my small town life and everything else in my life affected me and the way I think and how I approach things, and my family.
Thank you. Okay, juggling family and career. I know that was very challenging. Can you speak a bit more about that, please?
Well, I think the secret for me to being able to do that successfully was the fact that I had a very involved husband, and we were true partners in our marriage. And, you know, we always sort of agreed that family was going to be the key thing for us, and we were going to be there for our family. You know, he had a very busy career as well until he became disabled. But we always agreed that one of us, at least, would be wherever our kids were with their games, with their plays, with their whatever they were doing. And we always did that. We always tried, successfully tried not to travel at the same time. I did a lot of travel in my work, and he did as well, but we tried always to make sure that one of us was home. And we didn't do a whole lot other than be with our family and have our work. You know, we didn't have a lot of other things in our lives during the time that our kids were growing up. And we just sort of worked together to make it work. I think that's the best way I can say it. Were there stresses, as someone asked me this afternoon? Yes, always. But, you know, we worked together to work them out as best we could.
You've had a stellar career working with incredibly successful brands. What commonalities did you see shared by successful teams/organizations to generate the best ideas?
Oh, what a great question. Smart people working collaboratively, being respectful to each other's ideas, understanding that the best ideas probably come from a team rather than an individual, and respecting that and really encouraging that. And, you know, as I moved along, trying to sort of train other people to understand that and live that way as well. In terms of commonalities among successful brands, I think they're brands who really understood how important it was to understand the consumer and to start with really what are the consumers, the target consumers' wants, needs, hopes, dreams, worries, concerns, problems, etc., and to really develop products and marketing strategies, branding strategies, advertising strategies, really to deal with those issues, as opposed to starting the other way around. When I started in the advertising business during the Mad Men days, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with from the TV show, the way advertising got done, it was kind of interesting. It was mainly men who worked in the business, and they would sort of brainstorm ideas like, let's do a campaign about XYZ, and oftentimes their input would be from their wives, or maybe their secretaries, and then advertising would get created. And research started by testing the advertising to find out, did consumers understand it? Were they persuaded by it? Did they like it? But it didn't start with the consumer. Like, what does the consumer want? What does the consumer need? And I think the successful companies are the ones who understood that early on. Procter & Gamble was one of the companies who understood it early on. Now, we talked about Revlon. Revlon was created by a man named Charles Revson, a creative genius. And he invented this whole concept of glamour, larger than life. And his whole sort of brand strategy for Revlon had to do with projecting his brands. And you can, those of you who can remember Revlon in its heyday, remember Fire and Ice and all these glamorous, you know, models and so forth. I once got a call from one of the people who was one of his senior aides, and I was a little peanut at gray at the time. And he called me directly, which I thought was really unusual. He had a very gravelly voice, and he said, "Barbara, Mr. Revson needs to have you do a piece of research." And I said, "Okay, what?" And he said, he's thinking of having Elizabeth Taylor as a brand icon, and he wants to know, does that have any traction with consumers? And he said, "I don't want you to tell a soul about this conversation and about this research." And I thought, I'm like this little person at Gray, and I can't tell my boss. The head of our agency ran the business, ran the Revlon business, and I thought, how can I do this without telling him? So of course I told everybody, and I said, you know, I will be the front person. Don't you dare say anything, but please help me. So we did the research, and we found that there was absolutely no interest among consumers at that particular point in time for a brand having to do with Elizabeth Taylor. And I thought, oh my God, now I have to go and tell him this. And I went to Revlon, and they had a very fancy dining area, you know, very rococo and everything with gilt and what have you. And a butler came to greet me at the elevator, all dressed in his butler outfit, and took me into the room. And there were all these men from Revlon, no women, sitting around the table waiting for the lunch. And the butler rolled a gold chair up to the head of the table for Mr. Revson, and a gold little side table, and he pulled out a gold telephone. And the men were all very nervous, and I didn't quite know what was wrong. And it turned out that Mr. Revson was not in good health, and Vogue magazine had done an article about him and photographed him. And the advance copy of it came out that day, and he did not look well in the photograph. And he was furious. He was furious. He came striding into the room, and he said, how could you let this happen, to his guys? And they're all shaking in their boots. And I thought, and now I have to tell him that the world does not like Elizabeth Taylor. Oh my God. And so I stand up with my charts, and in my nervous, very professional way, take him through the data. And I say, well, so, you know, at this point, Mr. Revson, it looks like it would be a very hard row to hoe to bring in a brand with Elizabeth Taylor. He said, we do not ask women what they want, we tell them what they want. The end. And so I packed up my stuff and I left. I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder whether he'll go forward with Elizabeth Taylor. Well, it turned out he did not. So once again, I felt like, you know, the work that we did made a difference, and it helped him make probably the right decision at that time. But
he wasn't going to tell you had any influence on him.
no.
Yeah.
And you know, you asked what were the commonalities. The commonality was that he understood the power of advertising. He wasn't thrilled about the idea of research, but he did it, you know.
Right. Okay, next question. How would you define freedom?
Well, I think it really is what my father said. The freedom to think what you want, to say what you want, to do what you want, to understand the nature of really endless opportunities, and to dream the way you want, and to really try to pursue your dream. You know, my father said, we can read the paper, we can listen to the radio in those days. These were things that he couldn't do, and that's really, I think he was right in his definition.
All right, here's a tough one. What happened to you and Don Rhodes?
Life went on.
He went on to great success. I was a mere goober.
Well, we stayed friends.
So I'll say something about Don and his father. I mentioned was school superintendent from sometime in the 1940s till probably mid to late 60s, early mid 60s, 71. So Chet Rhodes developed a relationship with the Wests, and then the Wests didn't have children, and they had St. Helens Hotel, which this is before I-5. If you wanted to drive from Seattle to Portland, you drove by St. Helens Hotel, and it was definitely a going concern. And Chet Rhodes started bringing the West to hear football tickets and the school plays and come to the classes, and they really developed empathy and relationship with the students in this community. And here we are on this 18-acre piece of property that they gave to the school district, as Barbara says, in the 1940s, on the edge of town here. And when they passed away, of course, they started the scholarship funds, and the Kaufmans followed. And where's Bob Walters? We've calculated that approximately almost 3,000 graduating Bearcats have received West or Kaufman College scholarships since then. And even more than that, I don't think there would be a Shales Foundation involved in education without that. You know, most communities, it's a public agency. I pay my property taxes. That's my contribution to my school district. I'm not going to write a check on top of that for a public agency. But I think, thanks to Chet Rhodes and some others in the community, I think those people, West and Kaufman, started thinking more broadly and dreaming, and to the benefit of thousands and thousands of kids, but also to the people who followed, and Orrin Smith's one, and many others have contributed to direct benefit for children out of this community. And I think we are all the beneficiaries of that. And I just wanted to say again, Dawn, thank your family for really, I think, starting this whole amazing story. So, all right. Barbara,
Yes.
tell us about a typical day at the ad agency and your hours, products, et cetera. Any part of that.
My typical day, there's never a really typical day because there are so many different clients and so many different things to think about. But I generally would get to work at about 8 o'clock, 8:30, something like that. And you know, the advertising business, one of the things I loved about it is that it's such a collaborative business. You know, a team would consist of, I was the sort of the strategic person, really driven by the kind of research that I was describing to you. Then we would have an account person who was the liaison between Gray and our client, and was responsible for sort of making the initial interpretation of what the client's needs might be, and then drawing on the appropriate resources of the agency. So there would be an account person, there would be a creative team, including writers, art directors, filmmakers, producers, and there would be a media person, and the media person was responsible for determining where should the advertising run, to whom should it be directed, what kinds of media are we talking about, how frequently should it run, at what times of day, et cetera, et cetera. And in our agency, the great thing about it, and I think this is true of how you think about projects in your life, is we always got everybody together up front at the very beginning to sort of try and determine how to define the problem, how to define the dimensions of the problem. And then each of our special groups would go off and do their part of the job. I would go off and figure out, okay, what consumers do we need to talk to? What do we need to learn from them in order to figure out what our strategy should be? The creative people, we would then do a creative brief, and all of this, you know, goes into what might happen in a typical day. You know, you'd have meetings with these various groups. You'd meet with the client because, you know, we collaborated with them as well to say, here's our thought about which way we want to go. What do you think? How can you input to this? We would develop a brief, you know, which said, here's what our objective is, here's what our game plan is, et cetera. Then the creative people would go to work, and we'd re-meet as a group once again. And in a typical day, there are many of these types of meetings going on because we have a lot of different clients with problems at different stages of development and solutions. And then ultimately, we would present our work to our clients, and hopefully they would be enthusiastic about accepting it, and sometimes they weren't, and they'd say, oh my goodness, no, we could never do that. And we'd go back to the drawing board. I was very involved in Gray's activities, new business activities, to develop new accounts. So that was always very sort of extracurricular to the regular day's work, and so that involved a lot of nights and weekends of work. You know, and was very exciting and stressful and what have you. And there we had to sort of determine, why is this client upset with where they currently are? What are they looking for? What do they want? How can we really present Gray Gray's assets in a way that are tailored to really serving their needs? How can we give them some examples of how we've done this before and how it's been effective? So one of the great things is there's no real typical day. There's just sort of a lot going on, and it's one of the great things that I loved about the business, is to work on so many different types of problems where the principles for solving the problems are oftentimes the same, but they have to be adapted to different situations, and I really love that.
So I just realized we didn't account for something. We said we'll go from 6 to 7, and Barbara has to go to Walla Walla tonight?
No.
Tomorrow, all right. But we didn't account for the book signing part of this. So we won't run quite till 7 with the questions, if that's all right. We'll leave a little bit of time before 7 and then however long after 7. So I'll just ask 2 more questions. By the way, Haley, you get 5 stars for the most questions and the best questions. Okay, thank you. All right, I'm gonna ask one more of yours, and I'll ask one other from someone else. What advice would you give young and inexperienced teenagers when searching for a career?
I think, you know, I think you try to find your passion, but you don't always find it right away. Don't be afraid to try things, and understand that not everything is going to work out, and that's okay. You know, it's okay to try something, get some experience, think, you know, this is really not for me, and then try something else. You know, in my day, you didn't do that very much. You know, you went to one place and you sort of stayed there all your life. And you're lucky if you get to a place that you love and you're doing work that you love. I think it's so important to do work that you love if you possibly can. Sometimes it's not possible, but if you possibly can find what you love, it's just the best. It is the best. So keep at it, keep trying. And, you know, start young, get internships to, you know, get as much experience as you can, and try and determine what clicks with you, what makes you say, oh my God, this is it. That's a great feeling.
All right, one more. How long did your parents stay in Chehalis?
Till the end of my sophomore year at Whitman. So probably 17 years.
And then they were in Seattle.
Then they were in Seattle. They had to move to Seattle because my mother was very ill. She had cancer, and her doctors and her treatment center was at the now Fred Hutchinson Center, was then part of the Swedish hospital. And, you know, she would have to travel to Seattle, and she just couldn't do that anymore. So they ended up having to move to Seattle.
All right, sorry, here's one more. You were asked early on, I think I asked you, how has Chehalis changed? Here's the reverse. How has New York changed since you first moved there?
How has New York changed? Well, I don't think it's really changed that much, in that what I think is the best of New York is that, first of all, it's just throbbing with energy, very dynamic, very energetic, and it has so many top flight things: finance, business, medicine, technology, the arts, everything that you could think of, you know, is sort of the best of the best. And I think that's been the case, you know, certainly in my time in New York, but of course the specifics have changed over the years. And today, just like in Washington State and all over the place, technology has become a much bigger thing in New York. You know, it's really a technology center. So that's certainly a big thing.
All right, so we'll do book signing, and if you don't mind, let's bring the books up here for Barbara.
Thank
but
you.
Please join me in thanking Barbara for coming this way. There are so many ways that her story is an inspiration to kids here breaking the glass ceiling for women, but just from being able to come from here to go on to do anything. And that's really what the Student Achievement Initiative and the Shales Foundation work to promote as well. So thank you all very much for coming. And Barbara, again, thank you.
Oh,
Bless
well,
you.
thank you all. It's just been a delight for me to be with you, a joy for me to have come full circle and to be with you tonight. Thanks.